I always like to say that the survival of Black people in this country is itself a miracle of God, and that Black people in this country would not have survived without the church. Period. Point.
Thank you for watching another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Lisa Fields, the founder of the Jude 3 Project. And today I'm joined by a very special guest, Dr. Tiffany Gill. Welcome, Dr. Gill.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for accepting our invitation. We appreciate it. Before we get started, can you just let our audience know a little bit about you?
So, above all, I am a follower of Christ, who the Lord has taken, I think, into some really on an interesting journey. I came to faith actually in my first semester of graduate school, my first semester of a doctoral program, where I was pursuing a PhD in American history. And I think it's just a really interesting moment for me to have come to faith. So much of my faith, really the entirety of my faith, has gone hand in hand with my pursuit of this doctorate and then eventually becoming a professor. So I have a PhD in American history from Rutgers University. I teach history and Africana studies. I published a book called Beauty Shop Politics, African American Women's Activism in the Beauty Industry, that looks at the ways that beauty shops and beauticians were leaders in civil rights movements. And currently I serve as a deacon at Epiphany Fellowship Church in Philadelphia, and work on the Woke Church Initiative as well as with women's ministry.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And so today we're going to talk about something that fits right into your expertise, kind of defending the faith through history. Mm-hmm. And this is something that's been important for Jude 3 because one of the major pushbacks, I'm sure you've heard it, Christianity being the white man's religion. Mm-hmm. How have you navigated just your faith and your studies and American history?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, for me, when I read the stories of African Americans, it's completely tied with the story of the American church. And for me, it's important to make sure that that story is told in its entirety. When I think about history, when I think about studying history, I think about how important history is to us theologically, right? If we think about so many of the Old Testament books are at their core historical accounts, right? Many, even if we look at the book of Acts and others, there are accounts of what happened. And so to me, I find it just a real privilege and an honor to be able to tell stories with the understanding and knowing of God's providence and God's hand through it. And I think that when we look particularly at the history of African Americans, a few things stand out. One of the things for me is really the way that the Black church as we know it was born as a persecuted church. And I think that's important for us to remember and keep in mind. While Africans' engagement with Christianity predates the transatlantic slave trade, and you've had many experts on here who have talked about that to great effect, so I won't go there. But once Africans were forced in chains here in the New World, their adoption of the faith was not a simple mimicry of what white folks told them it was. And to me, this is a real sort of miracle of God, that we can look at the history of those who were enslaved by people who claimed to love the God that they were serving, right? Who used and manipulated scripture against them, even at a time when most of the enslaved people were illiterate. But that there was an enduring faith, there was an ability to understand the truth of who God was and who God is in spite of that. And for me, I think when we look at the difficulties that African Americans and other oppressed groups continue to have, that's really the story that needs to be told. I know there's been a lot of attention lately of really kind of delineating what the history of American racism in the church has been. And that's important because we can't forget that. And unfortunately, we still live with that. But I love to just focus on and emphasize the history and the legacies of the Black church and the theological richness that we can learn from that.
Yes, and I think that's very, very important and a helpful tool in engaging people who have questions about Christianity and the Black experience. Can you just talk about the very beginning of the Black church with Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, and what happened that birthed the Black church?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important in two ways to think about the birthing of the Black church, both the formal birthing of the Black church, which happens in Philadelphia at a moment of persecution, right? So Richard Allen and Absalom Jones were worshiping at a predominantly white Methodist church in Philadelphia. They were not able to sit among white parishioners. They were relegated to a balcony up top. And then really the straw that broke the camel's back for them was when, while they were praying, they were dragged off their feet and beaten and thrown out of the church. And that was really a moment where they realized that and it's amazing to me that their reaction was not to turn away from God, right? Many of us turn away for less reasons, but they knew that God was still worth pursuing. And so, but they realized they needed to build their own institution. They needed to have a church where it was safe for Black people to worship God. I mean, just in its most simplistic way. That's really where it came from, where they could be free to worship God and learn scripture and be safe while they worship and pray. And what's beautiful about the church that they built, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, is that here in Philadelphia and really all across America, it is the longest held property by African Americans. So that the Bethel AME Church still exists on a similar plot of land that they bought back in the early 19th century. And so to me, what that also reflects is not just the enduring theological legacy of the Black church, but also the way that the Black church has been an institution builder in Black communities, that these spaces, this land that was owned is something that is an enduring legacy of what the Black church was. But also I think what some scholars have called the invisible church is important to note. So while Richard Allen and Absalom Jones were free Blacks living in Philadelphia in the 19th century, there, of course, were African Americans who were enslaved, who were not able to have the money and the resources to buy land, although in some cases they did buy land for churches. But for the most part, on Sundays, they would have their own, what scholars call the invisible church, where sometimes on larger plantations, they may have attended church services with their slave masters and their slave masters' families, but often would spend the afternoon or the evening going out into arbors where they would have worship experiences for themselves, where they were able to celebrate and worship God without the watching of slave masters and slaveholders. And that's really where the theology of the Black church was built. There would often be, an enslaved person or maybe even a free Black who was a preacher. Typically, that was someone who was literate within the community. So when we think about Nat Turner and Nat Turner's Rebellion, Nat Turner was a slave preacher in Virginia. And so they were getting the word from people who were literate, oftentimes, people who knew the Bible and were teaching it to them. And so it was not, often there are these depictions that it was this very kind of emotional kind of church. And yes, there were expressions of worship that were something that were part of their culture. But these also were places where theology was formed, where the Bible was taught, and where Black folks were able to see a vision of God that was different than what was being force-fed to them.
Mm-hmm. That's so important, because I think you sharing that kind of changes the narrative in some people's minds as they're thinking through things, because people only know things oftentimes in this day and age by memes, by conspiracy theory videos and movies they've seen, and not necessarily going in depth in history. One of the main effects we get is by Dr. Umar Johnson. he doesn't necessarily come to us and push back, but some of the people that subscribe to his thinking will say that the Black church hasn't done anything economically to empower our communities throughout history. Can you speak a little to that? And what ways the Black church has empowered our community through justice and through economics as well?
You know, I always like to say that the survival of Black people in this country is itself a miracle of God, and that Black people in this country would not have survived without the church, period, point blank. Not just as a place of spiritual sustenance, but also in terms of the real things that were happening there. So even if we look at Allen AME or some of these early churches, they were always about meeting the theological needs of people, but churches were also places where there were what were called penny saver clubs, which were precursors, for example, to insurance companies that would not allow African Americans to purchase burial insurance or other kinds of things. Those things were facilitated through churches. Really, that, you know, there was no kind of state apparatus that was there to support African Americans who fell on hard times. And again, these were communities that were very economically disenfranchised in the 19th and early 20th century. And so it was churches that would raise money to support families in times of need. So literally the survival of families was built on churches. When we look at the period of the Great Migration, as many African Americans are transitioning and leaving the South and moving to the North, churches were on the forefront of helping African Americans build the networks to get jobs, to learn about housing, right? So very, very practical needs that were met. And then, of course, when we think about the civil rights movement, we know that many of the leadership and, you know, many of the kind of people who were on the front lines of the movement were people who were a part of churches. But also another piece we don't think about is that movements take money, right? Who was feeding the people at the marches? Who was raising money to get people out of jail during these movements? All of this is happening in and through the Black church. And even today, you know, the church that I attend and many churches, many Black churches around the country are still the ones that are serving as places of refuge, not just for their members only, but also for the wider community. And this is what I say also, that without sort of understanding and knowing the full history of the Black church, it leads us into all kinds of false ideas about who the church is. But even within the church, you know, when I think about the rise of things like the prosperity gospel, in light of the history of the Black church, that doesn't even make sense, right? Where it's really churches that are all about kind of lifting up a particular leader, churches that, you know, condemn people for having hard times and for suffering, that the Black church has always had a very robust theology of suffering. The Black church has always been on the forefront of meeting people's not just spiritual needs, but seeing it very linked to practical needs. And so when I even look now as debates are going on about, you know, the gospel and the social gospel and the impact of churches, to me, you know, Black churches have always been there. And now other churches are beginning to catch up on that. But I'm like, that's who Black churches have always been. So it's just false that they have not been there. Have there been abuses within the church? Absolutely. Are there churches that are contributing to declines in communities, churches that are trying to fleece people? Absolutely. But in the same way that enslaved people were able to see the difference between the true gospel of Christ and the false gospel of slaveholders, I think it also would do us well to understand that, you know, there are people who are saying and doing things in the name of Christ who aren't believers, and that there is a true gospel, and that the Black church has a tradition of being connected to that true gospel.
Mm-hmm. And that's important that you noted that if they can know truth, the difference between the true gospel and a false gospel without even being literate in some spaces,
right.
Then we should not necessarily be overly concerned that people can tell the difference oftentimes.
Right. And that's really a miracle. I mean, I really sort of sit with that, right? As much as people are theologically trained and all these degrees and all of that, that we discount, like, why aren't slave narratives being taught in seminaries, right? as reading Frederick Douglass, and when he is calling out the white American church for its hypocrisy, reading Henry McNeal Turner, these are theologically rich documents. Reading slave narratives, reading, some of the early church writings from the Black church. These should be read in seminaries far and wide, because they are grappling with many of the issues of the faith around suffering, around pain, etc. Like, these people have so much to teach us. And that, to me, as a historian, is sort of my greatest honor and privilege. And I always tell my students that just because people did not have access to literacy or to the internet or to Google and all of that did not mean that they were less intelligent, right? That there really is. And I think spiritually that is the case too. They may not have had big church buildings or big titles or seminary degrees, but had a rich understanding of the faith that was revealed to them by the Lord that I think we all would do well to learn from.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned a name that I'm sure many people aren't familiar with. They know Frederick Douglass, but tell us a little bit about Henry McNeal Turner.
Yeah, Turner is a really interesting figure, church figure. There's a scholar by the name of Andre Johnson that's done a lot of work of bringing his writings together. But Turner was a part of many different kind of what we might think of today as like civil rights organizations, but he was involved in questions around immigration, about whether African Americans could ever fully be free in America, and whether or not we should go to Africa. He was involved in things known as the Colored Convention movements, which were gatherings of African Americans in the late 19th and 20th centuries, where they talked about not just issues of faith, but talked about, practically, how do we live? How do we maneuver politically? How do we support ourselves? But at his heart, he was a church leader. And that's really the base and the basis from which he advocated and did his work. And I think there's so many folks, biographies for people who want to get into kind of learning more about Black church history. I think learning the biographies of these folks and reading their work and their writings, and particularly for women, I think there's such a rich and long tradition of women in the Black church who are calling us and could be instructive for us. I think about Fannie Lou Hamer and Ida B. Wells, women who were on the forefront of civil rights issues of their time, whether it's lynching in the case of Ida B. Wells, or whether it's voting rights and freedom struggles in the case of Fannie Lou Hamer. What we can sometimes forget and obscure, and I think this happens a lot in the way that their narratives are told, is how deeply rooted they were in faith as women of God, and really saw their advocacy as a reflection and an outgrowth of that faith. And so I think there's just so many folks that we need to take their faith seriously, and understand and study the way that their faith formed a theology that really led to their activism.
Yeah, faith did not make them docile.
Not at all. Not at all. Not at all. I mean, they understood the gospel in really comprehensive ways, and not as just a matter of personal salvation, which is important, but understanding that, we're doing kingdom work, right? And that kingdom work is so much bigger than that. And look, God's light is not shining. And so the lynching of Black men, and in many cases women, was one of those areas where Wells used her platform as a journalist to express the injustices there. Fannie Lou Hamer, with the beatings that she received for trying to vote, and seeing the economic injustice in her community in rural Mississippi, saw that as an affront to the kingdom of God, and her work reflected that.
Mm-hmm. And it was many people marching alongside Dr. King that were women that people forget about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, as a King, as important as he was, as important as many of his documents and calling out, Letter from Birmingham Jail is one of the, again, in the tradition of Douglass doing that. But really, the foot soldiers of the movement were, in many cases, these women whose stories we still haven't fully told and embraced. And what they did is that they use the organizational structures of the Black church to organize movements, right? When we think the civil rights movement wasn't just like, oh, people would just run out in the streets and have a march. Those were highly organized, highly strategized moments, and really the place where many of these women in particular who were involved in building that infrastructure, where they learned that those skills and where they learned how to implement in the networks that they use came directly from their experiences in church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's important that we highlight that the church wasn't on the sidelines, but they were active.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't want to overemphasize, because there is a romanticized view that all Black churches were
right. No.
the right movement, and it was a small percentage. Can you talk about a little bit about the percentage and the resistance that some of Black churches gave leaders like MLK and those that were working with him?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. When we look at the history of the civil rights movement and those who were either actively engaged or in leadership, or even those who participated in marches, it's a small percentage of people, and even a smaller percentage in terms of the church, that there was an outcry. There were fears, particularly as people are getting arrested, that this was seen as disruptive, that this was seen as countering the work of the church. And so there were religious leaders who came out against King. There were religious leaders that would preach to their congregations not to get involved in this work. And again, I don't necessarily see that as an affront to the history and legacy of the Black church, because often many of those churches who may have been a bit concerned about the tactics that were being used within the movement, right? So even though we have, and there were a multiplicity of tactics, so we know very much about the kind of nonviolent tactics of the of Martin Luther King and his organizations, but nonviolence was not passive, right? So there were people who thought that was too radical, of going to spaces that were segregated and sitting in, knowing that you would be arrested, knowing that you would be beaten, and that would bring about the news media and all that. There are people who challenged that. And then, of course, were people in the movement who believed in self-defense as part of the movement. And so, I think what that really just demonstrates, but even though they disagreed on tactics, many of these same Black pastors still believed that Black people should have full citizenship and should be free in America, right? They just believed in different ways of doing it. And I think that that's okay, right? Like, we should never expect or look, even within Black churches, and expect that everybody is going to agree on what the issues are and how to tackle them. So we really see a diversity of ideas, and I think reading them and studying them, and even looking at the debates among Black Christians, again, is something fruitful. I know what you're going to be doing in Chicago coming up in September, of having folks on different sides of the theological questions, but are still very much so, in conversation and a part of the Black church. Having those conversations, I think, is we need more of that. And so I'm really excited about what the work that you're going to be doing with that.
Thank you. I'm excited about it too.
Mm-hmm.
As long as it doesn't stress me out.
I'm sure it's a lot of work. Your reward will be in heaven.
I think everything that you shared was really helpful and important. For those who are looking to get more into Black history, Black church history, what resources would you recommend for them?
Mm-hmm. I'll just give names of some authors for them to look at that have written some really good and powerful texts. Scholars like John Blassingame, who's written a lot about slavery and enslaved churches. Albert Raboteau is another author, another historian, scholar, who has written extensively on it. I mentioned the collections of Henry McNeal Turner's writings by Andre Johnson. And then I would also recommend some of the work done in African-American women's history, most notably Evelyn Higginbotham's work, Righteous Discontent, where that very often used and misused and abused phrase, politics of respectability or respectability politics, actually originated in that work, which is part of a history of women within the Black Baptist church movement. And I'm blanking on folks now. It's gonna. Oh goodness, there's so many great works on there. Maybe we could do a link or something later. I'm blanking on titles now, but the work of Barbara Savage on religion. There are just many people whose work that people can start. And like I said, biographies. making sure that you're reading biographies by reputable scholars, things with footnotes, I always say. Make sure, even if you disagree, you know, these are folks, you know, some of these others are not believers, right? Like, it's okay. We can still learn something. We should be reading this stuff. But yeah, make sure it's stuff that is, you know, not just things floating around the internet, but something with some footnotes, with some research, with some archival digging. Those are the places to go. Yeah, biographies on people like Fannie Lou Hamer. China Kai Lee has a great biography on her. Yeah, there's great work out there.
Before I let you go, you mentioned respectability politics. Can you go into that a little bit?
Oh goodness. I sigh because it's really interesting to me because the book where the term "The Politics of Respectability" emerged, like I said, it was this book about Black Baptist women, and it was published back in 1992. And it's a phenomenal book. It's one of my favorites. But it's been interesting to see how that discussion has come back in the 21st century and really kind of been, I think, manipulated to wrong ends. And so I think in sort of contemporary Black freedom struggles, of which, you know, Black Lives Matter and others are part of. I could be wrong and stepping out of line here, but I think there's a lack of appreciation in some cases for the history of previous movements. This whole idea of like, this is not your grandmother's civil, you know, you're not your grandmother's movement. I'm like, well, it depends on who your grandmother was, right? I mean, there were people who were doing this kind of work before. And so this idea of the politics of respectability is, I think, at its heart, it's a critique of some of the, what people might consider moral-based actions and arguments that previous civil rights struggles have had. This whole idea that Black people have to present themselves as, you know, respectable and without flaw in order to be seen as worthy of civil rights, worthy of freedom. And I think there's a critique there. I mean, I think there's some flaws to that, but I also think that to completely dismiss that as, you know, this outdated notion is really insulting. These folks were dignified people who wanted to present themselves in particular ways, in some cases based on their background in the church, right? So they would go to the movement. When you look at old footage of civil rights, of the civil rights movement, you'll see people dressed like they're going to church, right? And that was, again, part of a visual narrative of, yes, respectability, but also this is the honor that these people brought to these movements coming out of church traditions. And so I think we just have to be really careful that we can make critiques of some of the strategies, some of the ways that they marginalize women, et cetera, but to do that in a way that doesn't completely dismiss the movement and the work that was done.
Yeah. And oftentimes, you know, by you being a historian, you know this, we in this generation, my generation will think, our generation will think we're doing something new when it's really not new.
None of it. Right. Like they're creating something. I'm like, you know, and it's great. There are innovations and all that, but I'm like, people would do well to look at what people did and what worked and what didn't. But yeah, I think there's sort of this millennial idea that everything that millennials do is new. And, you know, as a historian, I just, like you said, I just sit back and chuckle and be like, here, read a book.
Yeah. I think what you mentioned is really, really good, is especially when it comes to like the dressing up, because I hear people, you know, saying that, well, kind of shunning like dressing up because they're like, well, we don't need to do that. And I always think it's interesting. Oftentimes it's artists that do that, and they don't have necessarily the responsibility of going into a corporate world. So they have that liberty to say, I'm not going to dress up. I'm going to, you know, just be who I am, be free and creative.
Right.
But the majority of culture has to go in a job, especially if you've graduated from college, you have to go and you have to dress up. And that's just, no matter what race you are, that's kind of the standard. So it's always interesting talking about taking your P's and Q's on everything in culture from creatives, because they don't necessarily have the responsibilities that others have.
Yeah, and even, I mean, I think even within church, right? You know, there's you know, conversations about, and I think that's right, like church should become as you are. You shouldn't have to dress up or feel pressure to do so, but don't dismiss that, right? Like, you know, when I think about why Black women wore big church hats and why they dressed up on Sundays, many times these women were domestic workers during the week where they had to wear a uniform. And Sunday was the time where they got to not just be some, where they were considered, by the people that they worked for, just dismiss them, call them by their first names, didn't give them respect. Church was a place where, we gave them titles and honor. They were, deaconess so-and-so and first lady this, and they wore their outfits and they put on their best, right? That this was a place where they could be free to express themselves and give honor to God and really dignity for themselves, right? So sometimes when we look at certain traditions, they may seem outdated to us or may seem unnecessary, but, as a historian, I always like to think about, well, why? Like, why is dressing up or was dressing up, and in some circles still is, so important in the Black church? What did that mean? Well, if you're in a job as a man or woman where you are dismissed and your body is broken down, and Sunday was a place where you worship and honor God, you wanted to give it your all, right? So I think context is everything. And I think that even as we're looking at new ways of innovating, even as we're raising important critiques of institutions and tactics and strategies, not to be so overly dismissive that we miss the things we actually can learn from them.
Yeah, because it was something that was helpful that Dr. Wesley said some years ago that I heard him say, because when he was making the distinction between why titles are so important in the Black church, where people like to be called bishop and elder, and I'm like, well, you go to white church, they be like, well, call me Mike.
First name, right? Exactly. You call pastor by their first name, right?
And so you're like, well, white churches are more, in touch with humility than Black churches. And then when you think about, Dr. Wesley made the point of understanding the history and how people were treated throughout Monday through Saturday, it was important for them to have some dignity.
Absolutely. To honor, right? Like these are places where we can honor people that never get honored anywhere else. So yeah, I think there's something really beautiful about that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gill. How can people get in contact with you on social media?
I am at Sable Victorian, Sable Victorian, on Instagram and Twitter.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been a rich conversation, and I know our viewers will enjoy it.
Thank you so much for having me.
And one of the things I believe God has pressed upon me to press upon you is to raise a generation of Christians that are courageous and are not afraid to speak the truth in love.
Imagine what would have happened if he didn't listen to her because she was a spoil of war, because she was too young, because she was a woman. Wow. He would have missed out on his healing.
I didn't ask God why when I became the first Black woman to receive a PhD in Old Testament. I didn't ask God why when I became the first Black woman to become the Lyman Beecher Lecturer at Yale. I didn't ask God why when Spelman made me the Cosby Visiting Professor. I didn't ask God why when I became the first Black woman to receive tenure at Vanderbilt University. I'm surely ain't gonna ask God why now that I've got cancer.
I have a hope that is hard fought, hard won, and it's real.
To unflinchingly denounce the politics of fear and the alt-right racism that elected playboys while denouncing a Black man who was loyal to his wife all his years in office.